Queen and Collins uses the original brief of GPT to reposition the workplace and retail asset, as they've described it, and we've done that for urban opportunity as well. It's a design that celebrates the neo-Gothic heritage of the heritage-listed ANZ Bank site and draws upon its Venetian influences for urban intrigue, delight and passage to reconnect this quarter of a city block back into the city. It's a cluster of heritage and recent buildings. You probably know the ANZ Tower, which is very familiar with its Gothic silhouette. And I think one of the things we found particularly intriguing was how you might use and celebrate those references to create a series of seemingly public interior rooms and spaces as a way to transport us elsewhere. This idea of city imports was particularly interesting to us. So this is what we had to start with. The 1990s tower on the northern end, and then the cluster of heritage buildings. Very much about a commercial lobby feel, and certainly not something that encouraged people to enter into it and explore. Similarly, between the heritage buildings were introduced atriums and other elements that kind of, if you like, I used to think sort of blancmanged the whole thing together, so sort of merged it. So some of the initial project themes that we brought to the project, this idea of coherent difference, celebrating the different parts of the buildings, keeping their eccentricities, a certain flamboyance, opening up the block to the city, and a very important one, laneway, not lobby, and the idea of multiple entries. So as a series of little quick diagrams, the original figure ground on the left, sort of smeared, if you like. The proposed figure ground where we introduced a network of interstitial space to disaggregate the buildings. And last of all, this idea of a city within a city where each of the buildings' footprints are expressive of their own character. So laneway, not lobby, civic doors open to the city, bigger doors introduced, a reactivated street frontage, introduction of open air back into this interior, especially open to the sky and air, and upgraded lobbies and amenities. I should say the workplace component was done with BVN, and KTA was public realm, end of trip and podium. This idea of urban furniture, which is introduced throughout, again, making workplace a place of social life as well. Variety of levels, a lot to deal with in terms of accessibility, but you can see, is that okay? Can you, yeah. Many levels, the different sorts of spaces and their different characters pushed up against each other, these sorts of juxtapositions. Very intense floor plan, I won't dwell on. Suffice to say that really a lot of our work was creating this space here, this in-between space, which moves through a series of public interior rooms, if you like. So to quickly help you, the networks through the site, a lot more passage through it for anybody can use these, not just people going to the tower. The lobby up to the tower, the lift core, is really treated as part of this main central space rather than locked off at the perimeter. Retail tenancies, pathways through those, the pale yellow, these campiellos we introduced, which is small square in Venice. Then the commercial tenancies each had their own access to the individual buildings. So the material strategy was really to shift from a sort of more urbane, sophisticated, darker palette to the northern end and slowly getting lighter and cooler towards the southern end. So there's this transition of materials and their different characters. So Cathedral Courtyard, which is a bit more urban, casual and robust, onto the laneway, compared with the quiet and more reflective Campiello. So that's what just informs the material choices and the sort of slight changes in colour. So I'll just race through those. So taking you for a walk around the building, this is from the southwest corner, the ANZ Bank, leading into these new civic doorways, the sorts of changes that were made to the facade as an invitation to enter into the building, pass through it. All of these spaces will be retail. It is tricky with COVID and the city being the way it is. So we haven't got quite the life that's anticipated, but you've got some people starting to use it as their workplaces. And so you can see these series of one room or space to another. and this interesting combination of these newer retail blocks, if you like, adding to that cluster of the 3 heritage buildings to form these outdoor rooms. Big open air doors so that they can modify climate, make it comfortable, but still keep it as largely open air. Connections back from deep in the interior out back to the street. Open air again, particularly prescient with COVID, just having a workplace area and part of the city where it is sheltered, but also open air. Very intense pallets in this part, using stairs as something to encourage people to move between those levels. This is a co-working space on the first 3 levels. So that idea of the sort of urban spectacle and being able, the drama of moving between levels, looking across levels, these breakout areas on these little bridges is all part of that sense of intrigue, discovery, and urban delight, which was a big motivation for the project. The concierge who manages the security and introduction to the tower, the workplaces, these are the fit outs by BVN in the interiors of these. Back to the in-between space, moving to the southern Camp Yellow now, which is a bit quieter and cooler, looking towards the cathedral room, which is really the most magnificent, one of the finest interiors in Melbourne. Sadly, it was a very dead space. And so one of the biggest changes we made, very tricky with Heritage Victoria, but we got there, was to introduce another opening to its northern end to link it to this newly created courtyard space, which was where the original loading dock access was. So that, we think, was really transformative of the site and its flows. Underneath, you might have noticed in the cathedral room, this incredible glass floor. Underneath that is where we put end of trip. So that floor was restored and is a lovely
1 minute remaining.
space. Okay, last of all, heading towards Collins Street. Again, the individual entry off Collins Street. It's a site with many entries and addresses. And I think on that point, I might finish up. Thanks.